After creating a template out of some scrap plywood, I coated a piece of 01 tool steel with some layout fluid and used a scribe to mark the steel. I used some punches to mark the pin layout since the layout fluid would eventually be sanded off. Here I'm using my bench vise to hold the steel while I get a rough cut with the hacksaw. I then clean up the cuts and sand down to the line that I scribed earlier. I need to use a file to define some curves and get rid of a few gouges. Now's a good time to drill those pinholes. I recoat the knife in layout fluid and mark a center line for my bevel so I know when to stop grinding. Here I'm using a filing jig to make sure I have a nice, even bevel for the knife. I found the plans for this jig on the Golf Custom YouTube page. This part took most of a day to complete. This is the first time I actually questioned my motives for this project. Now it's time to flip the knife and repeat for the other side. It's important to keep the file very flat, or else you'll get a low spot one file length away from the plunge line, and also square off the tip of the blade if you're not careful. Both of these things actually happened to me, even while I was trying to avoid it. Luckily, I caught the damage in time and was able to fix these issues as I continued to grind away. Once the bevel on both sides are done, I now draw file both sides to make sure the bevel is completely flat. And before I continue working on my knife, I figure it's time to build the forge for heat treatment. This can dry while I spend hours sanding later. The forge is made from a 50-50 mix of sand and plaster of Paris. Mix in enough water to form a clay-like consistency and start packing it in the can. While that's drying, I decided to make my homemade micarta so that I could start drying as well. I'm building a small form that will help me clamp the paper evenly. I decided to go with green and black cardstock for the knife scales. It's held together with a fiberglass resin. Making sure to coat each layer evenly, I stack each piece of paper and wrap in wax paper to prevent sticking to my mold. Now that those two pieces are drying, it's time to get back to the really fun part of this project, sanding. Working my way from 120 grit all the way up to 800 grit, it takes me several hours to get the satin finish I'm going for. Now it's finally time to heat treat the steel. The reason 01 steel is popular for DIY knife makers is partly due to the fairly easy heat treating process. I'm using a propane torch to heat up the forge, and an old railroad spike will let me preheat the quenching oil before the blade goes in. One of the ways to see if the steel is hot enough is to use a magnet. Once the steel is no longer magnetic, it's ready to be quenched in the oil. At this point, I'm checking the hardness with a file. The steel's so hard the file skates across the blade and doesn't cut. But the blade is very brittle at this point, so we need to temper the steel for it to regain some of its toughness. I put it in the oven at 400 degrees for 2 hours. While the blade's in the oven, I pull my micarta out of the mold and get it ready for the knife. Once the blade's out of the oven, it's time to clean up the blade. Back to sanding again. Time to drill the pinhole locations in the micarta and cut a few pins out of 1/8 inch steel rod. I've traced out the knife on the micarta scales and trimmed them down so there's not a ton to sand later. Once I've done a test fit of the scales and make sure everything lines up correctly, I use some JB Weld to bond everything together. These will stay clamped overnight to fully cure. Once the epoxy is fully dried, it's time to shape the handle. I use the sander to bring the micarta even with the steel and then sand up to 800 grit while holding the knife to get the most comfortable grip possible. A tiny bit of teak oil really makes the colors pop in this handle. For the finishing touches, I'm using the Lansky sharpening system to give this knife a great edge. This is by far my most ambitious project so far. I spent 2 full weekends and a couple weeknights on this knife. I hope you all enjoyed it.